Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is open Photoshop, PS. And we're going to make a new document, create new. And let's choose horizontal. You can choose vertical if you want, and I'm going to put 14 for the width and 10 inches for the height and 360 pixels for the resolution. Resolution is really important. If you're painting a tiny painting at 72 pixels per inch, then it's never going to look right. So pay attention to these settings, size and resolution. Get enough pixels in there. And under color profile, instead of sRGB, pick Adobe RGB, which has a wider range of accurate colors. And hit create. And there we are. So in this painting exercise, we're going to do a complementary color scheme. So it's colors that are on the opposite side of the color spectrum. When I was your age, I was an intern for an illustrator named Ron Miller, who is a popular science fiction illustrator. And especially whenever he did paintings that involved people, he would always use this complementary color scheme. He would fill the entire background with a kind of a blue cyan color, which is the opposite of people's flesh tones. Basically, we're all a dull orange color, slightly darker or slightly lighter. And when you have the complementary color show through the blue part, then it really pops and gives it a three-dimensional effect and creates a lot more visual interest than if you just had variations on a flesh tone. So that's one of the things that I've retained from Ron Miller's artwork and his technique, and I still use it to this day. So I'm using this as one possible example for your color harmony project. Another good possibility is to do an analogous color scheme where you're using the traditional Renaissance method of painting in sepia tones underneath and then building up related tones that are close to each other on the color wheel. But we're going to do complementary here. So we're going to make a medium blue color. We're going to go down to the color picker here to select a color and go click, and we get the color picker. Over here is the general color on this slider. And then over here is differences in color saturation and darkness and lightness. Okay, so I'm going to get kind of a medium bluish cyan, more towards the blue. Hit OK. And this is the background. And this is one of the few times that we're actually going to paint onto the background. We're going to go to Edit, Fill, Foreground Color, and hit OK. Now we have a blue background. Now, getting ready to paint, again, we're going to make a second layer. And it's super important to make separate layers for separate things. For instance, we're now going to do a gesture drawing to map out the basic movement, visual movement, and placement of the objects in the piece. And if we do that on the same layer as the background layer, then those lines are permanently in there. So have separate layers for every separate activity in painting. You can merge them together later if you want to, but keeping everything on separate layers gives you a lot more control. So to do a new layer, we want to see the layers panel. If you don't see it, Window, Layers. Okay, here's the layers panel. And we go down to here, hit the little plus, and we made a new layer. And we're going to call this one Gesture. Okay. And I think it's really good to label your layers. All I do is click on it, click, and then I can type in a new name for it. Definitely name your layers so you know which is which. Okay. So now I'm going to select the brush tool, this tool right here. Make sure it says the brush tool, not pencil tool or mixer brush, etc. Just the plain old brush. And whenever you get a tool selected, you have all of the options up here. I'm going to give you more details about the options for customizing brushes in a separate video. But right now, where it says 121 here, you can adjust the size of the brush. And hardness means blurriness, basically. 100% hardness means not blurry at all. 0% means very blurry. I suggest not having it blurry at all at first to draw. If you try to draw with a blurry brush, then things are going to get muddy pretty quickly. Here's some choices of basic brushes. I'm going to pick the soft round pressure size just to get a little bit more character and a little bit more blendiness, but I have it at 100% hardness, and I'll adjust my size. So I want something that's pretty big but not too big to map out my gesture drawing. Then opacity is how see-through, how transparent it is, or how opaque it is. So I'm going to leave this one at 100% opacity. So the idea of a gesture drawing is a lot of quick movement, because it helps your drawing to, one, map out a good composition and create visual movement and liveliness. And on this one, even though we're using the gesture drawing just as a way to map things out, we're going to make the gesture layer invisible later. It's going to still make a lot of difference in terms of the liveliness of the composition. Now, I've used a Wacom tablet. I have a small tablet at home. You have Wacom tablets available to you through equipment checkout. There's also Cintiq tablets that you can draw right on, and those are really nice, and those should be in the hallway, and you should have access to those as well. But definitely use a Wacom drawing tablet or a Cintiq. Trying to draw with a mouse will be a very frustrating experience. And if you haven't used a tablet before, it might take a little getting used to, but it's well worth it. So for the gesture layer, we're using that as a reference. We're going to make it reduced in opacity. When you select a layer, you can adjust the opacity, and I'm going to have it at about 27%. So you can see it, but you can tell the difference on the new layer when we're drawing. So I'm going to hit the plus, create a new layer, and call that one contour. Now, contour drawing is sort of the opposite of gesture drawing. Gesture drawing is quick, has a lot of motion, and maps out the composition, where contour observes the details and the subtlety of the drawing. So make sure the contour layer is selected to make sure you're drawing on that. It's really easy to get confused and draw on the wrong layer and mess yourself up. So for this layer, I'm going to adjust the size of my brush so it's smaller. So now we're drawing the contour with the actual line work of the drawing. Now, some of this line work is probably going to be used to some extent to build detail and construction in the drawing, and some of it is just going to be used for reference also, because when you're painting, you have the option of painting over stuff and then leaving other stuff there. So don't be afraid to keep things that help structure your drawing, but don't be afraid to get rid of stuff, even if it's lovely, if it doesn't work to support your drawing as a whole. It's all about keeping what you need and just bringing everything together so it works as a whole. Notice at this point, when I felt like I didn't need it anymore for proportion and design, I've made my gesture drawing completely invisible. If you click on the eyeballs next to the layers in the layers panel, they can become invisible. And I finished my contour drawing. So now I'm looking at my RGB color wheel, and do make sure that it's an RGB color wheel. And I can see that across from blue is the orangish color. So those are the kind of colors that I'm going to go for in my complementary color scheme. And I'm going to make a new layer. And I'm going to call that layer Basic Paint. And I'm going to select a kind of a dull orangish color for my first color to map stuff out. And I'm going to hit OK. And now I'm going to make a different kind of brush. I'm going to make it slightly blurry because I want this broad paint to be a little bit blendy. And I'm going to increase the size. Basically, a good painting rule is macro to micro. Start out by blocking in the big shapes and don't worry about the details yet. Macro to micro, big to little. block in the basic shapes and observation of light, and then get into the details and the definition. Notice I'm leaving little bits of blue showing through wherever I can, wherever it makes sense to do that, so that it's poking through and shows little sparks of blue. It creates more excitement and more three-dimensional quality. Now, right now, I'm painting right over the lines because my layer with the basic paint is on top of the lines. So I'm going to do that for a while and figure out which lines I want to obscure and which ones I want to keep. But after a while, I'm going to move it so it's underneath the contour lines, so I can still get help with the definition by the lines that I've drawn. So at this point, I've decided I want my dark colors to be less vibrant and more dark. So I'm going down to Image, Adjustments, Replace Color, and I'm going to go to Lightness and make it a lot darker. Not that much darker. And I'm increasing the fuzziness so more is selected, making sure all my paint is selected, and I'm moving the saturation a little bit down so it's desaturated, and that starts to look a lot more like the color that I want to have. So remember, all of the image adjustments that you used with photographic stuff in the basic Photoshop instruction can also be applied to painting as well. And nothing has to be permanent. You can always alter things after the fact if it works better for you. So now I'm taking the layer and I'm moving the contour layer on top of the paint so I can see better the definition and the line work. That's why it's important to keep the line work separate than the basic paint, because if you're painting over it, then you don't have it anymore. So keep everything on a separate layer when it makes sense to do so. So once you get a color mix that you like, you can save it as a little palette for later reference. So we'll go to Window, Swatches. So we see the Swatches panel, and I'll hit the little plus, and I'll name it. You know, you could call it anything, but you could have a whole bunch of colors. For instance, if you're doing a complementary color scheme, you could have a whole bunch of dark and light and saturated and desaturated versions of a single color, like the orange to the brown, and then you could have the same thing with the blues, and darks, lights, saturated, desaturated, so you can have a little palette that you're ready to paint with consistently. And if you're painting and you want to sample a color while you're painting, if you have the brush tool selected, for instance, and you hold down the Alt Option key, Alt Option, it turns into an eyedropper, and I can go click and sample a color, and then that'll be the foreground color that I'll be painting with. So if you have several colors on there, you could just routinely Alt Option click and then start painting with that color. It's a shortcut. So now I'm creating a lighter color, and I'm painting in the mid-range and the lighter colors. So I'm going to skip ahead and show you now that I've added a lot more detail to the painting. So at this point I'm making my brush a little bit transparent, and I'm painting with transparency to start to try to blend things together. Now I'm going to select the smudge tool, and the smudge tool is a tool that can be used to blend paint together easily. So I'm further going to blend the edges of some of my paint using the smudge tool. Now I'm adding a new layer, and I'm going to put that above the contour layer because I'm going to start to obscure some of the lines and blend right over them. But I'm still keeping it separate than the contour layer because I want to have my options left open. I'm going to call this one Paint Detail. And the reason I'm adding a new layer is just to keep my options open. You know, it was just like a feeling that I got nervous and I didn't want to mess up what I had done already. So I made a new layer so I'm not touching my old layer while I'm working on blending and refining. So anytime you feel like it would benefit you to have a new layer, just do it. Okay, skipping ahead again, after fumbling around for a couple hours and blending in the paint until I'm satisfied. And one last thing, I decided on the background, rather than just leave it a single color background, even though that same color is showing through in the little sparks in the figure, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new blue color, which is a little darker and a little duller, a little less color saturated. And the reason I'm going to do that to paint in the background is that'll help the figure pop forward even further, especially with the bright blue sparks that are left in it. So I'm going to leave some of the bright blue showing through in the background, but I'm going to cover most of it with a darker color. And since it's going to be painted with little sparks showing through, it's going to be rendered in a style that's similar to what is going on in the figure. So that's a way of adding consistency. And I'm also going to paint right over some of the lines and right up to the edges of the figure, and that'll give me a chance to blend things in a little bit and help to shape the outside of the figure and clean up the outline basically and get rid of some of the lines, which is also a technique that's used in physical painting a lot. See, that's already blending in the hair a lot more with the background. And then I'm going to do one more thing. I'm going to make an even darker color and start using that slightly darker color at the bottom of the composition in the background, and that'll help to give it a sense of depth and weight and a little bit of variation. And then I'm going to blend that in. I've decided to do one more thing. I'm going to select the basic paint layer, our original layer, and I'm going to reduce the opacity to 75%. About. And you can see how that makes more of the blue show through in places, and it further integrates it and makes it look like it's more complete. So having some of the background color come through in the foreground color not only makes it three-dimensional and pops through, it makes it more of a purposeful, connected design. It has more visual unity as well.